welcome to our session today. Hindsight is 2020, Lessons Learned from Smart Pump Integration. I'm your moderator, Alberta Guy, and I'm a nurse informatics and a product consultant for Smart Pump EHR integration. Today with me is Amy Speenberg, clinical informatics specialist from Saratoga Hospital. Today's program is aimed at providing you with an overview of what smart pump programming is and the lessons learned. After all, hindsight is 2020. In July of this year, the ECRI Institute put together a great article on what to consider before implementing smart pump programming. And today we wanted Amy to share with us the ways that she was able to utilize similar considerations and a bit of what they wish they had known before taking on the project. If you're looking to implement smart pump programming, you'll want to take some notes on what we will be sharing today. So I'd like to begin with just a brief overview of what smart pump programming is. Smart pump EHR integration, or SPIRI, enables the creation of an electronic connection between the EHR and a smart pump. The process begins with utilizing barcode medication administration. This allows the patient and the medication and the smart pump to be associated with each other, enhancing safe medication administration. SPIRI is bidirectional, and that means you have one direction, which is auto-programming, and another direction, which is auto-documentation. Auto-programming, or smart pump programming, sends the IV medication order parameters to the smart pump. The data on the pump must be confirmed by the nurse and the start button pressed. Starting the IV does not happen automatically and by design to maintain safe med pass. Auto-documentation captures the data flowing back from the pump and is usually pump vendor specific, but often includes IV start and stop times, rate changes, volume, etc. This allows more timely and accurate infusion data. The success of the project relies heavily on drug alignment between the EHR and the pump drug library. This requires 100% commitment from a pharmacy staff. To verify the medications are aligned, there are two key required testing sessions. The first is functional or validation testing. This test allows us to test varying dosing methods, therapies, drug alignment between the EHR and the pump drug library. The second is comprehensive or full record testing. This is testing of every medication identified for integration. Testing also needs to be completed to confirm the data flow of the auto documentation using real-life situations for interacting with the pump. For example, pausing the pump or using a standby feature, etc. Now that you have a clear understanding of smart pump integration, let's begin our open discussion with Amy. Hi, Amy. The first question is based off of ECRI Institute's best practice. They suggest to review and analyze the EHR and the pump vendor workflow. Can you tell us how this went for your organization?
Yeah, hi. So I think one of the first things was we had to decide in our workflow what areas we would be using smart pump integration. A lot of the EHR workflow kind of determined if it was going to work or not. For example, one of our units, just the way the workflow is, the armamentary unit, the orders are put in after the medications are given a lot of times. Just in that instance, it wouldn't even matter what our EHR did as far as documentation went, because that we can make that work for that area. So just kind of figuring out what those areas are, what those kind of pieces are that aren't going to be, that are kind of out of your scope, is definitely something that you need in place. In addition, changes to the monitor dictionary and interventions for auto documentation. So we didn't have a monitor dictionary. Actually, we had to set up a monitor interface for our system to make this work. And then we had to plug all of our information in there, and then we had to make sure that we had places for that information to go into our Meditech system. So for our stop times, we had a reassessment on our EMR when we were doing intermittent IV medications. And so we had to look at what places were we going to do that? How are we going to make it? How are we going to make that go for just the areas that we're using the smart pump integration and auto documentation. And then we had to update our drugs that we would be sending over to the pump. And then we had to add the CDS an intervention for auto documentation. So basically, how are we going to get the information from our EMR over to our to the pump? And that was through interventions and attributes that worked that way. We did have some issues as far as documentation with volumes. So the pumps have the ability to send the volumes from the pumps back into Meditech, but the way that our EHR handles that is they weren't able to just take certain volumes, so it was actually sending more volumes than we needed it to send, so they just weren't accurate. So we tested that really thoroughly and we weren't able to do that. So that's also something that you might want to look at with your EHR is how those volumes are going to work, and then if they do work, how are you going to send them in, and where are those going to go as far as your documentation goes.
So Amy, did you already have selected your pump vendor before you decided to do integration?
Yep. So we had our pump vendor selected. Our pumps were implemented in June of 2017, and we had our smart pump integration didn't start until the beginning of 2019. So we actually had been using our pumps for quite a while before. So we did have a pretty robust drug library, but it needed some changes to do the pump integration.
Very good. The next question, Amy, is beyond the workflow, we've learned, and ECRI also shares great best practice about EHR readiness. How did you know that your EHR was ready, or that the workflow, the changes were needed in order to do integration?
We worked with our EHR vendor, which is Meditech Magic, and I had seen that Meditech Magic work with pump integration before, just not with our pump vendor. So I did know that it was an option, although they don't have the ability to do pump integration. So we had to use another vendor to do that, and it works through in conjunction with the Meditech Monitor interface. So that's how it works. But another thing, and I talked about this a bit before, was looking at the drug library. So I knew, you have to make sure that your pumps are available. You have to make sure that your pumps have the robust drug libraries. You have to make sure your pumps are wireless and that the pumps can send the information. You have to make sure that your EHR is able to accept the information. And in our case, we did have all those pieces in place.
I know as far as the drug library is concerned, it has to be integration ready. You could be using the drug library independently of integration, but when it comes to mapping the medications from the EHR to the pump drug library, they have to match as far as what dosing units you're using, the volume that's to be infused, et cetera. So was there a lot of consolidation or changes that needed to be made? Do you remember?
Yeah. So I'm not a pharmacist. Our pharmacist is actually unable to join the call or the webinar today. But there was a lot of work that had to go in. It was very heavy pharmacy work that had to go into place. So the changes to the EMR, as far as I was concerned, were pretty minimal. My job was more testing and kind of working on the workflow with the nursing units and just making sure all those pieces work together. I did the education for all the staff. But making sure that the drug library was ready and that our dictionaries in our pharmacy in Meditech work together. That was a lot of work from pharmacy, like a pretty hefty job. We had to do a lot of work with the way that drug strings are ordered, and then the way that doses, rates, things like that, the way that they were set up in the drug dictionary, they had to be mapped correctly into so that they would end up, in the pumps, so they wouldn't fail, because if you don't have an exact match in the drug library, you do have a fail, and that's on purpose because they don't want, errors to happen. So, so there were a lot of issues with that. We did a lot of testing with dose over time drugs. That's really any intermittent drugs. We did a ton of testing with dose over time drugs, trying to make those work correctly. And then, we had to do, your drug library also has to take into account, well, this drug can be a secondary, but this one can't be a secondary. This one can't have a secondary. So maybe this one's a primary, like heparin, for instance, like you can't send a secondary to heparin. So those are some things that we had to look at and make sure that we couldn't do that with integration. So we didn't want to like allow them or facilitate any errors happening because we didn't do our testing thoroughly enough. Let's see. I know we did a lot of work with titrations and how to make the titrations work, because the way that, and then, some of our drugs just, and again, I'm not a pharmacist. This is just, but we do work so closely together. I feel like I can speak to a lot of this. So for instance, one of our drugs, I mentioned heparin earlier, I just feel like this one always comes up. That order is initially ordered by weight, but really what's sent to the pump is units per hour. So we had to figure out a solution where the pharmacy, when they're verifying the medication, they actually are changing that to units per hour. So it's not going over as a weight-based drug because it's not intended to be a weight-based drug. Just the initial dose is weight-based. But then, you have to talk about where are you getting your weights out of your EMR? Do you want to send weights from your EMR? Are those weights accurate? So I swear, Alberta, I know you were there for some of those discussions. It felt like 3 months of them. Discussions about just the patient's weight. What weight are we going to take? Are we going to send it? Are we not going to send it? So we actually ended up not sending weights to the pumps. We just didn't think that was safe because we weren't positive that the weight was accurate. It was just going to send the most recent weight, just it's the way that our EMR works. And it's possible that another EMR, it would work very well. It just doesn't work in our EMR. So we actually decided to send the weights right from the pump. Not to send the weights. I'm sorry, let me back up. To enter them on the pump after the medication was auto-programmed. So for like critical drugs, anything that's weight-based, that's how that is set up.
And Amy, just to dovetail off of that a little bit, we know that, this is a huge patient safety initiative, and the goal is to, for the nurse to not have to press as many buttons as possible on the machine, obviously, because if that's where your errors occur. But one of the enhancements that we've been able to do with our product is actually be able to grab maybe an ideal body weight that was calculated within an admin criteria and be able to send that to a pump. So that might actually help with your weight-based medications in the future. So moving on to the next question. ECRI sometimes, anytime actually you're implementing a project, you need to develop a timeline, and there are lessons learned from project timelines. Were there any delays along the way with your project timeline? Any lessons learned?
Oh boy, well, that's a loaded question, Alberta.
I know.
Yes. Yeah. So we had an interesting. So I say we went live with our pumps in 2017. We really started working on this project, I think, in like February of 2018, and it's supposed to be, I think, a 9-month timeline from kickoff to go live, and it ended up for us being a little over a year. And so, everything, it's a big process. You have to have all those meetings, a lot of it. Like I said, that even that weight issue took 3 months to figure out. A lot of them are just workflow discussions that you have to have internally and figure out what's best for your hospital and what you're gonna, how you're gonna approach some of those things. And then of course, there could be technology issues. So because there's a couple different things. I'll just try to be organized in my thoughts about these. So first, we did have really good wireless. They'd already done wireless surveys in our facility. We had really good wireless support from our IT department. And they, and then when they did the surveys, everything was fine. We did the testing and we put them in different areas, and all the wireless was fine. When we put some pumps out, we were finding that they were not having wireless, and the reason was not because the wireless was bad. It was because on the particular pump that we have, the wireless lives on the battery, and the batteries were getting old. So it was just a matter of they just needed to be replaced, and it wasn't anything that we were doing wrong. It wasn't that we didn't have good Wi-Fi. It was just that was the problem. So that was a little bit of a frustrator. But now we figured that out. If we have an issue where a nurse tells me that the pump's not connecting to wireless, I say, put in a biomed ticket. They just probably need a new battery, and that solves the problem. So that's really good. Another issue that we had is we have, which it sounds like it's a great idea, but it turns out it doesn't work as well as you'd think. We have these monitors in ICU that have PCs built into them, which is ideal. Like, it sounds great for the physical layout of the room, so you don't have an additional computer, because you can just click this button on the monitors and it says IPC and it pops up a Windows computer and you can log in. And the issue is that we had a lot of problems when we installed the software to do the pump integration. We had a lot of issues with those particular computers. And I mean, we were one of the first hospitals to do this with Meditech. So really we were testing until the last minute to make sure that we had everything working properly. And then when we installed it on the PCs, we found that it was making the computer so slow. Every time I scanned a med, it was taking 30 seconds until they could scan the next medication when they were administering meds. So we had to postpone the project, and we had to take all of that software off of all of their PCs and figure out how to make this work better. So that probably bumped it back a few months. So yeah, we had a big issue with that. So I think that was
in other words,
the
the lesson learned
problem.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the lesson learned is to be sure and test all of the various devices that you have throughout your facility to make sure that that they have wireless connection, or if there's Citrix, something of that nature that might interfere with that, the programming and the integration process. So.
Yep, we have certain PCs that are set up as kiosk accounts, so you don't actually log in as a user. Those ones had some issues. We had some PCs that were swapped out for Windows 10 and nobody told us. So, we had to figure out how to get them to work with Windows 10. So all those things are sorted out now, but, kind of while we were in the midst of it, it was a lot of work. And, if I had to go back, I would try to find out all those different devices and try to test on each one of those, because I don't think we realized how many different setups we had in different areas of our hospital. Yep, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you're ready, we can move on to the next question, which is,
Sure.
moving beyond the prep of the system and using it in real life, meaning, okay, you're post-go live, what lessons might be learned in hindsight as far as maintenance requirements once you are live? And were you, prior to that, did you reach out to any other facilities that maybe have already done integration with your pump vendor or with your EHR to know what maybe they needed to do as far as daily maintenance goes, or, pump library, drug updates, that kind of thing?
Well, we were the first ones to integrate Meditech with the B-Broad pumps that we have. So we didn't really have anyone to ask. I mean, we had some different, there were people who were using the B-Broad pumps, so they were using other EMRs. They were using Cerner, they were using Epic, and it just works very differently. So just because that data is coming out of that pump doesn't mean it's going to work the same in your EHR as it works in someone else's. So that was one thing. so we didn't really have anybody to ask these questions to. Some things that we probably didn't think about that would have that would have been nice. They're kind of just satisfiers for nurses. And I think, talking to Alberta, I think a lot of the enhancements are going to probably be able to fix those issues. One of the biggest ones was, so those PCs that we have in the ICU, like I said already, they sound like a great idea, but they're not that great of an idea because they're stuck on the boom and you can't move them. So that means if you have a patient, if it's on the right side of the patient's wristband is on the left side of them, or, and then their pump is on the other side, then just the physical space and your footsteps are just so many. It's a big frustrator for nursing because they were having to take like 20 or 30 steps just to give that one medication, which in some of the other units isn't a big deal because if they're using a cart, they can wheel right up to the IV pump and it's not a big deal, So, but those computers in ICU don't move. So that was a big one. Another one was, we thought we had sorted out how we could get everything to work for titrations. But, kind of what we decided to do didn't exactly work. And it ended up being that if the nurse hadn't initiated the titratable drug using smart pump integration, so maybe the first one got started in the code or something, or it just got started and they were busy and they didn't even scan it first, they just hung it. And, the next time we went to scan it, it would actually revert it back to the original order because it's the order coming out of our EHR. It makes perfect sense as to why it's doing that, because there's nothing to tell the EHR or to tell our pump integration system what's running on the pump because you haven't connected the two yet. So that was a problem, and we found that if the nurses weren't watching carefully, that they had accidentally reverted back to the initial titration dose when they'd spent hours trying to get the patient stable under, and they're good nurses, and they caught it, and they were able to fix it relatively quickly. But that became kind of a dissatisfier in our ICU. But I think hopefully we'll be able to resolve that with the enhancements as well. And really it works beautifully as long as they're doing it the whole time, as long as they're doing every single bag, and they're starting with the initial bag, then it works really nice the way that we have set it up. It's just those things you don't really think about in workflow as many times as you talk about it that you don't really foresee happening, and then you're like, oh geez. We've tested, so.
Yeah, I've attended some other webinars where people talk about that whole walk around the bed scenario where you're starting on one side of the bed and you have to walk around, and those trips around the bed can really be a dissatisfier just based off of how, the room is set up, like
right.
you said, with a device on one side and the pump on the other, and then where's the patient's armband,
yep.
and, which wrist is it on, and et cetera. So, yeah, titration rate changes and things. Are you capturing those in your auto documentation, your rate changes?
We do capture rates in our auto documentation. We capture start times, stop times. Like I said, we weren't able to capture volumes because I couldn't get them to work correctly. And it was our EHR. It wasn't anything, that was the pump's fault. It was just a limitation of our EMR. We have an older EMR, so we're used to hearing that there's limitations. Yep, so we're able to capture the drug name, dose, the rate, and then the start and stop times right now. So that information, the nurse doesn't have to do anything. It just automatically goes into the system, which is nice for our coders. And since we still have, after we went live, we said, oh, this will be great. The coders will have to review the charts anymore. And there's still, you have to take into consideration, sometimes you have a failure. Sometimes that wireless isn't working. Sometimes they don't get that with smart pump integration. And now the coders are looking in two different places, so then I had to meet with the coders after we went live and said, okay, how are we going to fix this? So we actually ended up writing a report to pull in both values. So whether it was documented in the EMR, like I mentioned earlier, documented in the EMR, meaning they did the reassessment and manually documented the stop time. And basically that's not value added for nursing at all. It's just because we need to capture it for financial reasons. So between that and the auto documentation, those are different different queries, different questions. So we have pulled those into our report together. So they just have to run the report by account number, and then all the data will be there now. So which is really nice. And they're not going through a million places in the chart.
Great, great. I can also interject, if you don't mind, the whole volume calculation that Meditech, that you experienced with Meditech, we are, with one of our enhancements, we are now able to capture that volume. So, which is a great satisfier for nursing, not having to remember to go back in at the end of shift or those types of scenarios to capture the volume that infused for the IV. So, great stuff.
Yeah. That's the question we always get is, are you guys able, can we send, do we have to document our volumes? I'm like, well, for now, yes, but I mean, one thing I find is that, one thing I find is that when our EHR says we have limitations, that's pretty much the end of it. But if we ask Iatrix, then you guys will say, oh, okay, well, we'll find a way to fix this, and the EHR can, which is nice, So no. So they're just making up for the limitations of our EHR at this point.
Just to wrap it up, which I think we've already kind of answered this question, Amy, so maybe we can just talk a little more about, implementing smart pump programming. Is there anything else in general you wish you would have known in advance? But I think we kind of already talked about a lot of those things.
Well, I just want to talk about the education that we did, because we had I'll just say the fortune of having to do the education twice, because this is a great lesson learned. So the first time I tried to do it, we did classes, and we had to reset up everybody, and like even teaching people how to do this, you have a certain amount of pumps. We were having to like either undo or discharge patients, readmit patients, and it was a lot of work to do the classes. And then when everything wasn't working, I was also teaching the classes in the front of the room, but I'm also, we're not a huge organization. We have like 190 beds. It's not like there's 4 of me, there's 1 of me, so I was doing it all. And when everything started breaking and I had to start troubleshooting with the company, I was like, I don't know if we're going to be able to go live, but yeah, we still have classes. What do I do? So we eventually did make the decision to postpone the go live. We stopped classes, and when we started them again, we made it a lot easier for ourselves. And we just made we didn't make the IVs scheduled, so we were able to just document them multiple times in the same patients without having to discharge patients, add meds, discharge meds. So that made it a lot easier for education. And I actually just recorded video clips and did audio, and gave them booklets with instructions, and had kind of like just a proctor in the room helping them. And somebody who was kind of a super user were able to help them, but they didn't have to teach them, because I had taught everything in the little video modules that I did, and that was really helpful. And then they could come down whenever they wanted. So they'd come down for a half hour during their shift if they wanted to, and there wasn't a scheduled time they had to be there. Which was really nice. So that was helpful. I feel like that was huge. And now we kind of do all of our education like that, because it just is so much easier. Because when you're working on the floor, number one, you probably don't want to come in on your day off to do something like that. And it's nice if you can just say, oh, I have, my patient's off the floor. I have half an hour. Maybe you can watch my patient so I can go do this kind of thing. So that was, I think that was really helpful. And I think I'd also say, just don't underestimate the amount of time it actually takes to test and troubleshoot things if they go wrong, because, sometimes we'd find errors and it would just be because our drug library or the mapping wasn't done correctly, or, so, I mean, I think I think the timeline is definitely doable. I think you just need to have the right amount of resources on it and allow yourself the time to do all the testing thoroughly, because you don't want to end up going live and having a lot of problems, which we didn't have a ton, but we did have enough. So, but I think it went pretty well.
Great, thank you. I just have a few other comments, if maybe it will spur some of our discussion. I think we also need to keep in mind some any areas that might be out of scope, and I know you touched upon those, but it's important to remember that in order to do smart pump EHR integration, you have to do bedside medication verification or barcode scanning, as well as you have to have a smart pump in that area. So I do know some facilities may have a different version of a pump in maybe an outpatient area than what they may have on their inpatient area. So it is important for that scenario to be kind of addressed up front. But you also need to kind of keep that in mind as you are doing training, because your drug library becomes set up for integration, but yet you have areas that aren't integrating that their pump drug library changes, because maybe you built out your antibiotics where in the beginning it was just something generic like IV antibiotic. So just kind of want to remind people that as you go down the integration path, and there will be things that are out of scope or areas that are out of scope, to just keep them in mind. Did you have anything to add to that, Amy?
Yeah, so we had a lot of areas that we used the EMR in that ended up not being in scope for the project. So like our PACU, they just do everything as Omnicell polls, like areas like that, surgery center. And really, if you have Tylenol, it's Tylenol no matter where it is. So it doesn't matter if you're in our surgery center, if you're in the OR, if you're in maternity, it's Tylenol. So if you're trying to give Tylenol IV and you wanted to have pump, and we wanted to do pump integration, yet we needed the nurse to land on a screen to say to send it somewhere. Well, we didn't want to disrupt every other nurse in the hospital who's not doing that. So we had to add some code into the EHR on the administration screens where we were pulling in our account numbers and things like that and saying, do you want to send this to the smart pump for smart pump integration? We restricted those by location in the background, and that required a lot of testing too. So basically those would just auto file, and then the nurses on the other floors don't even see it. They really don't even know it exists if their patients aren't ever in those locations that we do it. And then for those drugs that we don't do it, we just didn't add that screen at all. So that was actually a little bit easier to exclude drugs than to exclude a patient population. And we just have a really, really smart pharmacy analyst too. She's so brilliant, Natalie. And she was the one who wrote the code for that. She's awesome. Sometimes I wonder what we would do without her, honestly. I'm very lucky.
Also, I know during discovery, the discovery process of workflow and integration, did you discover any inconsistencies or different practices that happen between units that in order for integration to be the same without those units, that things had to change? And one example that comes to mind is you have to have an order on your MAR to do smart pump programming. And there's oftentimes a practice with flush bags where some units have them on their MAR, some units don't. Were there any changes that you needed to do in order to have consistent practices between your nursing units?
Oh yeah. Gosh, you're bringing back so many memories. I think I hid these away. So, and honestly, this actually started, I think just because we'd never really worked with the drug library before, so we kind of had already started to change our practices. So I think then it came up again when we did the smart pump integration. When we implemented just the pumps without the integration with the drug library, the volumes are set in there. So then the nurses are like, well, what do I do with my, some of the nurses are like, well, the medicine didn't get in there. It says it's empty, like it's bringing with the bag's empty. And then we said, well, yeah, because every intermittent IV is supposed to have a flush bag with it. And then some of the nurses were like, what? Like they'd never ever done that before, and they would just set the volume to a little bit lower than what the volume was supposed to be on the pump. They would just do that themselves, and so when they hung the next bag, then they would just start it again. I'm like, oh my goodness. So we really had to do a lot of education with all of our nurses to get them standard, and so we basically put it into our new IV pump policy that anytime that you're running something that's an intermittent infusion, that it has to be hung with a flush. So that was really important. That took a lot of work to get everybody to do that. So that we had to use it. We used the education department. We had to do demos. I had to go up and show people how to do it. I mean, it was really interesting, that. And then we had to say, okay, are we going to add these flush bags as an order? Are we going to put them on the EMR? And, we just ended up saying, we're not even going to put them on the EMR. It's really not an order. It's just in our policy that we do it. So we don't send those over to the pump. We just, the practice would be that they would program the flush bag start the flush bag and then send the secondary over through smart pump integration. Because, also the flush rate could change, because if you're giving like Offermem or Tylenol IV, that rate is 400 milliliters an hour. If you're giving Zosyn, it's 12 and a half. So what's your flush rate? That really should be decided by the nurse. So that was another reason that we decided not to do that. Thanks for the reminder, Alberta. I forgot about that one.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there's a lot of things to think about whenever you go down the path of integration. It's not magic in that, and not Meditech magic, but magic in the sense that it's plug and play. It's not. There's a process that has to happen in order to, get the medication to flow properly to the pump and then back again, and those data points that come back from the pump that populate into your EHR. So that's all the questions I have for you today, Amy. I really appreciate this conversation, and I think it's great stuff. So I'm going to ask the other Amy, the IATRIC Amy, if we have any questions in our question pane.
We do, actually. Carrie has questions that I'm going to combine into one. He's got two questions. So it says here, has this been implemented with Expanse yet? And then as a follow-up, we were heavily looking into getting this started last year when the pump vendor cost became a huge barrier. Has there been any further collaboration with them to bring the cost down?
My answer to that, and it is true that there is a cost associated with integration with the pump vendor, as well as with if you go with the IATRIC systems, meaning that you're with Meditech. We are entertaining doing it with Expanse. We have developed it in our dev site. We're working on contracts as we speak with a client that does have Expanse, so that will be coming. But again, we have developed it out in our Expanse dev site. So, and unfortunately, I can't speak to the cost for the pump vendor. Any other questions, Amy?
Yeah, this is a question, and I know the two of you talked a lot about resources from Amy's side. So this came in earlier, but how many full-time employees does it take to do the project? And who would you recommend as a resource for the participants?
I can kind of address that, and then Amy can chime in based off of what really happened within her facility. But there are some industry estimates for resources that are required from the hospital's perspective. With pharmacy, the estimate is about 500 or so hours, and that sounds like a lot, but the majority of their time, and we can't stress it enough, is aligning the EHR drug listing with the pump drug library. Again, a lot of that requires mapping of the medications from EHR to the pump, as well as pharmacy is heavily involved in testing, because they're the ones that ultimately need to decide how that medication needs to be defined. We as nurses don't have that knowledge in order to make those changes within either the drug dictionary or the pump drug library. As far as nursing hours are concerned, the estimates are around 350 or plus hours. And a lot of that time is spent with workflow analysis as well as testing. I'm finding out that, it varies from site to site. Some pharmacists are adept at, doing the smart pump program and interacting with the pump. And then there are sites that pharmacists are not quite as familiar with doing that. So some of nursing's time is also with testing. As we're making changes and aligning our drugs, we need a nurse to interact with the pump, so that, if we are asking her to maybe do a multi-step process with a particular medication, maybe that's not a workflow that they're familiar with. So nursing hours are about 350 or so. We also need information technology to be involved. Some of that is about 200 hours or so. A lot of that is, system setup to ensure that, things are communicating properly through the interfaces. And then also biomedical engineering. We estimate about 200 hours. A lot of that is, again, getting the device, the pumps set up for maybe test versus live. You'll also have to barcode your pumps because you need to associate the patient with the pump. So there's barcode technology involved. The barcode scanners, you can continue to use what you're currently using with your bedside medication verification, but the barcode that actually exists on the pump, you have to consider where you're going to put it, what size it might need to be, is it easily accessible to the nurse to scan, etc. So that's where biomedical engineering comes into play with that. So, Amy, do you have any real life estimates that your facility kind of needed to participate or resources?
I think your sounds about right. I know we really only had one pharmacist working on this, and she did spend most of her time on it. The testing was a lot. And then we had, I think, 4 different site visits with you guys. And those are over multiple days. So it's, that's like where you get into all the testing and really kicking us off to do the complete testing, but just making sure everything is working okay. We also implemented RFID on our pumps during this time. So actually, when we had to, the pharmacy and biomed kind of fought over who was going to put stickers on the pumps with barcodes. But since biomed was already pulling all the pumps back in to put the RFID tags on them, we did actually get them to put the stickers on them as well. But actually, I know this isn't to do with resource time, but in education, just make sure you're teaching them which barcode to scan, because nurses still call me and they're like, because I don't think I specified, I didn't show them a picture of it, because it looked different when we were testing than it looked when we went live. The barcode stickers were different on our test pumps. And sometimes they were scanned. There's like 3 pumps, there's 3 barcodes on our pumps. There's one on the RFID tag, one on the top of the pump, and one on the front of the pump. And then if they're scanned,
wow,
they scan the wrong one. It's as simple as that, which is interesting. But that's a little, I digress. But yeah, so it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work for biomed, and then a lot of work for IT, because even troubleshooting those issues with some of our stuff not working with the different types of workstations we had was difficult as well. So that took a lot of unplanned IT time, I think. And then just when you're talking about nursing, I mean, you have to put a big chunk of that to making education and doing education and covering the units when you're actually going live. So like your time is completely, like, that is hundreds of hours right there even. So I might even say that it's more nursing hours than that, because, that might have been just what I did. But we also had super users involved. We also had, I had another nurse informaticist that was helping me. Yeah, so education helped quite a bit too. And then just even the meetings that we had to have with the different areas, we had to meet a lot with ICU and the ICU director and then the other units, just to make sure that we were understanding their workflows completely. So it was a lot of work.
Right. And just to add to that whole concept of super users, one of the major testing phases that you have to go through is comprehensive or full record testing. And to do that, you're testing every medication that's to be utilized for integration. And to handle that, which could be hundreds of drugs, we'll put it that way. So to handle that, we often recommend super users come in to do the testing during that phase. One, to expose them to the integration process, which is a great learning opportunity, and then you can utilize them to help you with your training of your end users. So there is a resource commitment, not only for those who are actively on the project, but the super users that will help you transition from the project to a go live scenario. So great conversation. Amy, are there any other questions in the questions pane?
Nope, that does it for questions for today. So
okay, thank you.
Great. Well, with that, I just want to thank Amy and Alberta both for your time. This has been a wonderful discussion. I'm sure our listeners have a lot of takeaways of what the project looks like and what they should be thinking about ahead of time. So that's wonderful. Thanks, Amy and Alberta.
Thank you, Amy.